The morning mist hung low over London as Queen Elizabeth II stepped out of her black Rolls-Royce at Westminster Abbey. The ancient stones of the cathedral seemed to whisper stories of centuries past, but today they would witness something deeply personal. At 96 years old, the Queen moved slowly but with dignity, her walking stick tapping gently against the cobblestones. Lady Sarah, her lady-in-waiting, walked beside her, carrying a simple wreath of red poppies. The flowers had been chosen carefully, each one representing the countless soldiers who had given their lives for their country. The Queen had insisted on selecting them herself the night before, her weathered hands touching each delicate petal as memories flooded back. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere was thick with reverence. The tomb of the unknown warrior lay before them, a simple black marble stone that had become one of Britain's most sacred sites. The Queen had visited this tomb many times throughout her long reign, but today felt different. Today, she carried the weight of personal loss and national remembrance in her heart. Canon David, the Abbey's senior priest, greeted her with a gentle bow. He had served the royal family for over 20 years and could see the emotion in the Queen's eyes. This was not just another royal duty. This was something she needed to do for herself and for her late husband, Prince Philip, who had served with distinction in the Royal Navy during World War II. The Queen approached the tomb slowly. The inscription read simply, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War 1914 to 1918 for king and country." Beneath those words lay a soldier whose name would never be known, whose family would never know where he rested, but whose sacrifice represented millions of others. As she stood there, the Queen's mind drifted back to her childhood during World War II. She remembered the air raid sirens, the nights spent in the underground shelters, and the fear that gripped the nation. She thought of her father, King George VI, who had stayed in London throughout the Blitz, refusing to flee to safety. She remembered her own service in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, where she had learned to drive trucks and repair engines, determined to do her part for the war effort. The Abbey was almost empty except for a few palace staff and security personnel. The Queen had requested privacy for this moment. She wanted to stand here not as a monarch, but as a woman who had lived through war, who had lost friends and family members, and who understood the true cost of freedom. Lady Sarah stepped forward and handed the Queen the wreath. The poppies seemed to glow in the soft light, filtering through the Abbey's ancient windows. Each flower had been placed with care, and attached to the wreath was a simple card written in the Queen's own handwriting. The Queen knelt slowly, her joints protesting with age, and placed the wreath at the foot of the tomb. Her fingers lingered on the cold marble for a moment, and those watching could see her lips moving in silent prayer. She was thinking of Prince Philip, who had died just 2 years earlier, and of all the brave men and women who had served alongside him. Standing again with some difficulty, the Queen remained motionless for several minutes. The silence in the Abbey was profound, broken only by the distant sound of London traffic and the soft footsteps of tourists being quietly redirected by security staff. This was her time, her moment to honor not just the unknown warrior, but all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice. Canon David had prepared a short service, but the Queen had asked for just a few moments of silence instead. She believed that some tributes were best given without words, that the presence of the heart was more powerful than any speech or ceremony. As she finally turned to leave, the Queen took one last look at the tomb. The black marble reflected her image faintly, and for a moment, it seemed as though past and present were connected across the decades. The unknown warrior had died in a muddy trench in France over a century ago, yet here he lay in the heart of Britain, honored by the woman who had dedicated her life to serving the nation he had died to protect. The Queen walked slowly back toward the Abbey entrance, her duty completed but her heart still full of memories and gratitude. Outside, London continued its busy pace, largely unaware that their monarch had just paid one of the most personal tributes of her long reign to a soldier whose name would never be known, but whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. 3 hours earlier, in the private chambers of Buckingham Palace, the Queen had sat at her writing desk, struggling to find the right words for the card that would accompany her wreath. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting shadows across the antique furniture that had witnessed decades of royal history. She had written and rewritten the message several times. How do you address someone whose name you will never know? How do you thank a soul who gave everything for strangers he would never meet? Finally, she settled on simple words that came from her heart, in grateful remembrance of your sacrifice and that of all who served. Your courage lives on in the freedom you helped secure. The Queen's personal secretary, Sir Edward, had quietly entered the room as she sealed the envelope. He had served the royal household for 15 years and had never seen the Queen so personally invested in what others might consider a routine royal engagement. But Sir Edward understood that this visit to Westminster Abbey was anything but routine. Earlier that week, the Queen had been reading through old letters from Prince Philip's naval service. Among them, she had found a photograph of Philip standing with his shipmates on the deck of HMS Valiant. Most of the young men in that photograph had not survived the war. As she held the faded picture, she realized how easily Philip could have been the unknown soldier lying beneath Westminster Abbey. The decision to make this private tribute had come suddenly. The Queen had been scheduled for a routine visit to open a new wing of a London hospital, but she had asked Sir Edward to quietly reschedule it. Instead, she wanted to visit the unknown warrior's tomb, alone with her thoughts and memories. Lady Sarah had been surprised by the request, but had immediately understood its importance. She had worked closely with the Queen for over a decade, and knew that beneath the formal exterior of monarchy beat the heart of a woman who had experienced love, loss, and the weight of duty. This visit was about connecting with something deeper than royal protocol. As the Queen prepared to leave the palace, she walked past the portrait gallery that lined the long corridor leading to the main entrance. Each painting told a story of British history. Kings and queens, prime ministers and generals, all of whom had faced their own moments of crisis and decision. But today she was thinking about those whose portraits would never hang in palaces, whose names would never appear in history books. The drive through London to Westminster Abbey gave the Queen time to reflect further. She watched ordinary people going about their morning routines, commuters hurrying to catch buses, mothers walking children to school, shopkeepers opening their stores. All of this everyday life existed because of the sacrifices made by people like the unknown warrior. Prince Philip had often spoken about his wartime service, not with glory or pride, but with a quiet understanding of what it meant to face death for something greater than yourself. He had told her stories of friends who had died in the Mediterranean, of ships that had been sunk with all hands, of the random nature of survival in war. It could have been any of us, he had said once. And the Queen had never forgotten those words. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the Queen noticed a small group of tourists gathered outside. Among them was an elderly man wearing military medals on his jacket. He stood at attention as her car passed, and the Queen was struck by the connection between this unknown veteran and the unknown soldier she was about to honor. Both represented the millions who had served, the living and the dead united in their commitment to something beyond themselves. Inside the Abbey, Canon David had prepared carefully for this unusual visit. He had researched the history of the unknown warrior's tomb, learning details that he thought might interest the Queen. The body had been chosen at random from 4 unidentified British soldiers found on the battlefields of France. It had been brought back to England in 1920 and interred with full honors, representing not just British forces, but all the Commonwealth soldiers who had fallen. The Queen was particularly moved by one detail Canon David shared with her. The tomb had been covered with a communion flag from the Abbey, and the inscription had been carved by the same craftsman who had worked on many of the Abbey's ancient monuments. This unknown soldier had been given honors equal to any king or hero in British history. As she stood before the tomb, the Queen thought about the soldier's final moments. Had he been afraid? Had he thought of home? Had he known that his sacrifice would mean freedom for future generations? These questions would never be answered, but somehow that made his sacrifice even more poignant. The Queen also reflected on her own role as a monarch. For 70 years, she had been the symbolic head of a nation that this unknown soldier had died to protect. She had seen Britain through the Cold War, through social changes, through moments of triumph and crisis. In many ways, her life's work had been to honor the legacy of people like him, to preserve the democracy and freedom that their sacrifices had made possible. After placing the wreath, the Queen remained by the tomb longer than anyone had expected. Lady Sarah and Sir Edward exchanged glances, both recognizing that something profound was happening. This was not the formal, measured Queen they knew from public ceremonies. This was a deeply personal moment of connection across time and circumstance. The Queen's thoughts drifted to her coronation in 1953, when she had made her sacred oath to serve her people. That day, Westminster Abbey had been filled with dignitaries from around the world, television cameras, and the weight of centuries of tradition. Today, the same ancient stones surrounded her, but the atmosphere was entirely different, intimate, reflective, and heavy with unspoken emotion. She remembered the young woman she had been then, barely 25 years old, suddenly thrust into a role she had never expected to inherit so young. Her father's early death had changed everything, and she had often wondered if she was truly prepared for the responsibilities that lay ahead. But standing here now, after 7 decades of service, she realized that the unknown warrior had faced an even greater challenge, giving up not just years of service, but life itself. Canon David watched from a respectful distance, moved by the Queen's obvious emotion. In his years of ministry, he had presided over many royal ceremonies, but this quiet tribute felt more significant than any of the grand state occasions. Here was the monarch of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, arguably the most famous woman in the world, honoring an anonymous soldier with the same reverence she might show to her own family. The Abbey itself seemed to respond to the moment. Dust motes danced in the colored light streaming through the medieval windows, and the ancient timber creaked softly overhead. Westminster Abbey had witnessed coronations, royal weddings, state funerals, and countless moments of national importance, but today it held something different, a conversation between a queen and a soldier separated by more than a century, united by their dedication to service. As the Queen stood in silence, she thought about the changing nature of warfare since the unknown warrior's death. The First World War had been fought in trenches, with soldiers facing each other across no man's land in a terrible dance of death. Modern conflicts were different, more technological, more precise, but no less dangerous for those who served. The fundamental courage required remained the same. She recalled visiting wounded soldiers in military hospitals throughout her reign. Young men and women, some barely out of their teens, who had been injured serving their country in places like Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Their faces had reminded her of the young soldier who lay beneath this marble stone, determined, brave, and willing to sacrifice for something greater than themselves. The Queen's mind also turned to the families of those who had died in service. Throughout her reign, she had met thousands of mothers, fathers, wives, husbands, and children who had lost loved ones to war. She had seen their grief, their pride, and their struggle to understand why their family member had to die. The unknown warrior represented all of their losses, all of their unanswered questions, and all of their fierce love for someone who would never come home. Lady Sarah noticed that the Queen's eyes had filled with tears, something she had rarely witnessed in all their years together. Even at Prince Philip's funeral, the Queen had maintained her composure publicly, though Lady Sarah knew the private grief had been overwhelming. Today, something about this anonymous soldier's sacrifice had touched a place in the Queen's heart that formal ceremonies could not reach. The simplicity of the tomb struck the Queen powerfully. Unlike the elaborate monuments to famous historical figures throughout the Abbey, this grave was marked only by essential words carved in plain stone. No lengthy description of battles won or territories conquered, no list of titles or achievements. just the acknowledgement of service and sacrifice. In its simplicity lay its power. As she prepared to leave, the Queen noticed a few tourists being held back by security at the entrance to the Abbey. Among them was a family with 2 young children, probably visiting London for the first time. The children were looking curiously toward where she stood, wondering why this elderly lady was receiving so much attention from the guards and officials. The Queen thought about those children's future. They would grow up in a world shaped by the sacrifice of people like the unknown warrior. They would enjoy freedoms that had been purchased with blood, attend schools that existed because democracy had been preserved, and live lives that would be their own to choose because others had chosen to fight for that right. She also reflected on her own grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Prince William and Prince Harry had both served in the military, carrying on a family tradition of service that connected them to the unknown warrior across the generations. She was proud that they had chosen to serve, that they understood the responsibility that came with privilege, and that they honored the legacy of all who had come before them. The Abbey's acoustics were perfect, and the Queen could hear the faint sounds of London life continuing outside: car horns, construction work, the chatter of tourists. Life went on because of sacrifices like the one made by the soldier beneath her feet. Cities thrived, children played, families gathered, and dreams were pursued because of the courage of people whose names history would never remember. As the Queen finally stepped away from the tomb, she moved slowly toward the side chapel where many other military memorials stood. Each plaque, each carved name, each regimental banner told a story of service and loss. But her eyes were drawn to one particular memorial, a small bronze plaque commemorating the nurses who had died in both World Wars. The plaque reminded her of her own service during World War II, when she had joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service as Princess Elizabeth. She had been 18 years old, determined to contribute to the war effort despite the palace's initial reluctance to allow her to serve. Learning to drive military vehicles and repair engines had been her first real experience of life outside the royal bubble, and it had shaped her understanding of duty and service forever. She remembered the other young women she had served alongside, girls from working-class families who had left jobs in factories and shops to join the war effort. They had treated her as just another recruit, and she had treasured that experience of being valued for her contribution rather than her title. Many of those women had gone on to serve in dangerous postings, and some had not returned home. Canon David approached quietly and offered to show the Queen another part of the Abbey's military history, but she shook her head gently. She wanted to stay near the unknown warrior's tomb for a few more minutes. There was something about this anonymous soldier that spoke to her in a way that famous generals and celebrated heroes could not. Perhaps it was because the unknown warrior represented the ordinary person who became extraordinary through service. He had not been born to privilege or position. He had probably worked in a factory or on a farm before the war called him to serve. He might have been scared, homesick, and uncertain, but he had answered when his country needed him. The Queen thought about the telegram that would have been sent to his family, informing them that he was missing in action. She imagined his mother waiting by the window for news that would never come, his father checking the casualty lists in the newspapers, his sweetheart wondering if he would ever return to the future they had planned together. These unknown families had made sacrifices too, living with uncertainty and eventually with the terrible knowledge that their loved one would never come home. Lady Sarah had been quietly observing the Queen's emotional journey throughout this visit. She had served the royal family long enough to understand that the Queen's public composure was carefully maintained, but that underneath lay deep wells of feeling and connection to her people. Today, those feelings were very close to the surface. The Queen walked back to the tomb one final time and knelt again, this time more slowly and with obvious difficulty. She placed her hand flat against the marble surface and closed her eyes. In that moment, she was not thinking as a monarch or a head of state, but as a human being connecting with another human being across the boundaries of death and time. She thought about what she would say to this unknown soldier if she could speak with him. She would want to tell him that his sacrifice had mattered, that the world he had helped save had become a place where democracy flourished, where his countrymen lived in freedom, where children grew up safe and secure. She would want him to know that he was remembered not just on formal occasions, but in the everyday moments when people exercised the rights he had died to protect. The Queen also thought about what this soldier might say to her. Perhaps he would be amazed to learn that a woman had become monarch and had reigned for 70 years. He had lived in an era when women could not even vote, yet here stood a queen who had become one of the most respected leaders in the world. Perhaps he would be proud to know that his sacrifice had contributed to a future where such progress was possible. Standing again with some effort, the Queen noticed that her wreath looked perfect against the dark marble of the tomb. The red poppies seemed to glow with their own inner light, and she was satisfied that she had chosen the right tribute. The flowers would fade and be replaced, but the gesture they represented would endure. As she prepared to leave Westminster Abbey, the Queen took one last look around the ancient building that had been the setting for so many important moments in her life and reign. She had been crowned here, had attended countless state services here, and had said goodbye to many dear friends at funeral services held within these walls. Today, she was saying goodbye to someone she had never met, but who had shaped her entire life through his sacrifice. Sir Edward stepped forward to indicate that it was time to return to Buckingham Palace. The Queen's schedule was carefully managed, and there were other duties waiting. But as she walked slowly toward the Abbey entrance, she moved as though reluctant to leave this sacred space and the profound peace she had found here. The tourists who had been waiting outside watched curiously as the Queen emerged from the Abbey. Most of them probably did not realize they had just witnessed one of the most personal and meaningful moments of her long reign. They saw an elderly woman walking slowly to her car, but they could not see the weight of emotion and memory she carried with her. The journey back to Buckingham Palace passed in contemplative silence. The Queen sat quietly in the back of her Rolls-Royce, watching London flow past the windows, the same London that the unknown warrior had helped save over a century ago. The city had changed dramatically since his time, but the spirit that had driven him to sacrifice everything remained alive in the bustling streets and determined faces of its people. As they passed through the palace gates, the Queen reflected on how this private tribute had affected her more deeply than many of the grand state occasions she had presided over during her reign. There is something profoundly moving about honoring someone whose identity would forever remain a mystery. In many ways, the unknown warrior represented the best of human nature, selfless service without the expectation of personal recognition or reward. Lady Sarah helped the Queen from the car, noticing that the earlier emotion had settled into a quiet sense of peace. The visit to Westminster Abbey had accomplished something important, though it would be difficult to put into words exactly what had transpired. Sometimes the most meaningful moments in life happened in silence, in the space between heartbeats, in the connection between souls separated by time, but united by purpose. Once inside the palace, the Queen retired to her private study, the same room where she had struggled earlier that morning to write the card for her wreath. Now, as she sat at her desk, she felt compelled to record her thoughts about the experience. She rarely kept a personal diary, but today seemed to call for some kind of permanent record of what she had felt and learned. She wrote slowly, her handwriting still elegant despite her advanced age. Today I stood before the tomb of a soldier whose name I will never know, whose face I will never see, whose story I will never hear. Yet I felt closer to him than to many of the famous people I have met throughout my reign. He represents something pure and uncomplicated, love of country expressed through the ultimate sacrifice. The Queen paused in her writing, thinking about how to capture the complexity of her emotions. In honoring him, I felt that I was honoring every person who has chosen service over self-interest, duty over comfort, the needs of others over personal desires. This includes not just soldiers, but nurses, teachers, firefighters, police officers, and countless ordinary people who make extraordinary choices every day. She continued writing, aware that this private reflection was one of the most honest things she had ever put on paper. As I near the end of my own long service, I find myself thinking often about legacy and meaning. What will history remember? What difference have any of us made? Standing before that unknown soldier's tomb today, I realize that perhaps the most important contributions are often the ones that go unrecognized and unrecorded. The afternoon light was beginning to fade as the Queen finished her personal account of the morning's events. She sealed the pages in an envelope marked for her private papers, knowing that someday historians might read these words and gain insight into the human heart that had beaten beneath the crown for so many decades. Sir Edward knocked gently and entered with the evening's correspondence. Among the letters was one from a military charity thanking the Queen for her support of veterans' families. Reading it, she was struck by how perfectly it connected to her morning's experience. The unknown warrior's legacy lived on not just in marble monuments, but in the ongoing work of caring for those who served and their families. As evening approached, the Queen made an unusual request. She asked that a moment of silence be observed during the palace's evening staff meeting, in honor of all who had died in service to their country. The request surprised the household staff, but they immediately understood its importance. Word spread quickly through the palace corridors, and at precisely 6 o'clock, everyone stopped what they were doing for 2 minutes of reflection. Later that evening, as the Queen prepared for bed, she looked out her window toward Westminster, where the unknown warrior lay in his eternal rest. The abbey was lit softly against the London darkness, and she imagined her wreath still fresh upon his tomb. Tomorrow, tourists would come and go, most unaware of the private tribute that had been paid there that morning. The Queen's final thoughts, as she settled for the night, were about continuity and connection. She thought about the chain of service that linked her to the unknown warrior, to Prince Philip, to all who had worn the uniform and taken the oath. Tomorrow would bring new duties and responsibilities, but tonight she could rest in the knowledge that she had honored someone who truly deserved honor. In the weeks that followed, the Queen would never speak publicly about her private visit to Westminster Abbey. It had been a personal pilgrimage, a moment of communion with history and sacrifice that belonged to her alone. But those who knew her well noticed a subtle change, a deeper serenity, a stronger connection to the meaning behind the ceremonies and traditions she upheld. The unknown warrior continued to rest beneath Westminster Abbey's ancient stones, unaware that he had been visited by the monarch whose reign had been shaped by the values he had died defending. His anonymity remained complete, but his influence had touched even the highest levels of the kingdom he had served. In death, he had achieved something remarkable. He had reminded a queen of what it truly meant to serve.